We're going. We're here. Hello, everybody. And welcome to an afternoon of history and alternate history. The history that we're making today is that this is the first installment of what we're calling a jam session, which we hope will turn into a lengthy series of literary conversations. Jam session is a part of Riff, which is an evolving blog, conversation starter, online clearinghouse for readers and writers that is in development. It's going to be fantastic. And Riff is a part of Writers at Large, which is a new online literary entity that can be found at writersatlarge.com, writers-at-large.com. There you can buy books from Firewheel Editions, which is a small nonprofit press, and you can explore volunteer opportunities and get in on the ground floor of something that I think is going to be really cool. You can also like the Facebook page at Writers at Large and get involved in Riff right there. All that is the history-making part of today. The alternate history comes from our guest, Dennis Bock. He is to my left. I don't know if he's to your right or down. It's Zoom times. Who knows how this works? Dennis is a novelist and short story writer and lecturer at the University of Toronto. His novel, Going Home Again, was a finalist for the 2013 Scotiabank Giller Prize, which is a big deal. His books have been published in translation in 8 languages and 22 territories. His 5th novel is The Good German, this one. There we go. Hey, mine looks backwards. It's like in stereo we've got going here. It's published by HarperCollins in Canada. It's available through your favorite bookseller, probably, if you're willing to wait. If you can't find it from them, harangue them until they will get you a copy. It is worth it. It is, Margaret Atwood called it a cunning, I can't read my handwriting, cunning and compelling tale of deeply unexpected consequences. And the Toronto Star called it a gripping and rather terrifying read. Note to self, don't hastily scrawl notes on your typewritten notes when you're about to introduce somebody. Point is, it's a wonderful book, and we are very lucky to have Dennis here with us today. Thank you for joining us, Dennis.
A pleasure to be here, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Can we start off, can you tell us what the book is about?
Well, the story itself is, I was going to say it's quite simple, but in fact, it's not quite simple. But the starting point is it focuses on 2 characters, one of whom is a real historical figure named Georg Elser, and he's the guy who came as close to anybody ever had to assassinating Adolf Hitler. And his attempt failed in 1939, but in my novel, he does not fail, he succeeds. And this is an act of altruism, this is an act of idealism, this is an act of patriotism in order to, slow down the war and end the war. But the great irony is that instead of slowing down the war and ending the war, it in fact accelerates the war. It creates a situation in Europe that permits the Nazis to actually win World War II. The second storyline follows that storyline is told in the 3rd person. The second storyline is told in the 1st person, and that follows the story of a young, well, he's an older man looking back at his life in 1960 when he was a young boy in Ontario in Canada, and the 2 stories slowly come together. And so as Georg Elser survives after the attempt, he's captured and so on, but he escapes, and the story follows his journey through Europe to Canada, where eventually the 2 storylines meet. And during that time, we see how the world has been changed by this simple but fundamental act of actually assassinating Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, it's and I just want to say it's when I heard the description, I thought, oh, that's kind of it's science fiction like, and yet it's I guess what it reminded me of. There's the novel Station 11, which is billed as kind of science fiction, but when you get into it, it's actually this very deep and rich and moving look at humans. Rather, the history is in the backdrop, but it's really
Yeah.
it's about people.
Yeah, I'm glad you felt that, Mike. I take this really really big iconic moment in the alternate history world, which is, what if Hitler had died, right?
Mhm.
So it's so iconic that it's almost cliched, like if you handle it like glancingly, it's not going to work, right? But I really did my best to bring this history down to the human level, right? So
Mhm.
it's an iconic moment, but the novel is filled with, I hope anyway, with actual people. So I'm really interested in characterization, right? In
Yeah.
like trying to understand how a real person would have reacted, to these events, and what their life would look like, in this alternate history. So when I describe the novel in really basic terms, it might appear to be quite plot heavy,
Mhm.
um, but and there is plot, right? And
Yeah,
plot
definitely.
in the sense that, it gives us a reason to read on. We want to find out what happens next, right? But I like to think of myself, when I think of myself as a writer, I think of myself as a character writer. I'm really interested in developing characters, right? And finding the right voice in which to articulate those characters. So that's the kind of writer I am. I mean, I like to really slow it down. I mean, I think I've got a really fast moving plot, but I took as much time as I needed to in order to really, ground my characters and make them real human beings rather than sort of pawns in this great big global, chessboard
Yeah.
type thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm curious. So, what made you want to tell their story? I mean, what was the moment where you said, no, this is the novel I want to tell?
Yeah.
What sparked that?
Well, I mean, when I was a little kid growing up in southwestern Ontario, I mean, my parents were German immigrants, right? So they came over to Canada from Germany in the mid '50s, and and we had this kind of packing crate in our basement, like this big wooden box that we stored our skates and our scarves and our winter coats in during the summertime. That kind of thing, just like in our old half finished basement. And one day I asked my dad, like, where did that? Why do we have this box here, Dad? By the way, what like? And he told me that he had built the box, this big, sort of, three people could have fit in it. It was that big. And he said he built it to ship our belongings back to Germany, because they had finished with their Canadian immigrant experience. They wanted to go back because being an immigrant was just like not what they bargained for. This was about 10 years after they had arrived to Canada, and I was a baby. So he told me, that they were about a week away or something from returning to Germany after a 10-year experiment in being like Canadian immigrants or something, right? German immigrants in Canada. And and when he told me that, I heard that when I was maybe 10 or 12 years old or something. And I thought, wow, okay, this is my first experience with an alternate history. What if my parents had taken me back? Well, I'd never been before. I was
Mhm.
born in Canada, right? What if I had grown up in Germany, right? I mean, I would, my first language would be German, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, what would have changed? Would I be a different person, right? So this kind of like really excited and terrified me at the same time. The question, of, who would you have been if you had grown up in Australia as opposed to Texas or something like that, right?
Mhm.
Um, how much of our essential selves remains, the same if we grow up in an alternate sort of, an alternate history kind of thing. So that was my first brush with the idea like parallels or alternate histories or something like that. The second reason I was really interested in writing this book is because, like, after the fact that I'm interested in taking these iconic moments in history, or like the attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler, I wrote another book called The Ash Garden, which
Hmm.
is focused on the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. I'm really interested in these big moments, but um, finding those regular, real, normal people in these big stories, because my parents grew up as children during the war in Germany, right? So they were like 8 years old when the war started. And so when I grew up hearing their stories, that was my first exposure to the war story, and it
Hmm.
was the small personal story. It wasn't like the 10,000-foot perspective of what the war meant to countries and to Europe
Hmm.
and whatever political machinations were going on. So, my first contact with the war story was my mom telling me her own small,
Yeah.
tragic little experiences, right? And so
Yeah.
that's what sort of draws me to the characters that I'm drawn to, the little guy, right? That's caught up in this tremendous, horrific geopolitical struggle, right? So,
Yeah.
so my I always sort of fall into that that attempt to understand, you know, what that person would be feeling like on that Tuesday morning when something like
Yeah.
a global, proportion happens, right?
Yeah.
So I think that specificity is often, gives us a truer sense of the times than if you were to pull back, and get this like really sort of great big global perspective of what's happening.
Yeah, and I have to say, just on a personal level, that resonated with me because I happen to be the son of a German immigrant who came to he went to California instead of Canada, so the first two letters are the same, but
Right.
about
Yeah.
the same time as your parents. He's a little bit
Right.
younger, but it's uh, that same thing of when you start learning about World War II in the history book, saying,
Yeah.
"Wait a minute, that was my family was there." And I've learned recently, I mean, that there's such a thing as a generational trauma where even though you, as the son of someone like that, you weren't there, but the trauma of what happened affects the next generation. And I felt like there was a theme of that in your book. I mean, is that
Oh,
something you're conscious of?
yeah, Mike, absolutely. Like the book is about generational guilt, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, every protagonist, this is my writing 101 class, right? Every protagonist, has to long for something, is driven by a desire, right? And that's the idea of the quest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my first person narrator, he's driven by the longing to prove to his community that he is not just like any other dirty German, right? So in his community, because the Germans have won the war and fascism rules Europe, naturally anybody connected with anything having to do with German ancestry in his community is hated, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's an object of ridicule, as his whole family is, right? And so all he wants to do as a 12 and 13-year-old boy is prove to anybody who will listen that he's actually one of the good guys, that his ancestry does not define him, right? That the blood in his veins is not acid, it's not
Mm-hmm.
toxic. He's actually a good person, and he struggles to understand why he's condemned the way he is. I mean, he understands intellectually, but it's this sort of prejudice that prevails over his community, the whole country, in fact. And I mean, I felt that same thing as a kid. I mean, not to such an extent, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
but my first experience with prejudice was when I was in kindergarten. And I was whatever 6 or whatever years old I was when you're in kindergarten, and I heard for the first time that I was, guilty of the of propagating the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And I was I heard the word gas chamber for the first time. These are from like second and third year grade schoolers or
Mm-hmm.
something, and I didn't even know what that meant. But I was I was complicit in some way that confused me and terrified me, right? So in this novel, I really torqued up the pressure on that idea that because your ancestry, stems from whatever place back in Europe or wherever, that you are assigned that generational guilt. You have to bear that burden. So that drives the narrator to do what he does in order to free himself of that guilt.
Yeah, no, and again, there we could compare notes. I have similar, not exactly, but similar experiences growing up.
Right.
And I imagine that anybody who had been an immigrant anywhere, it's not just unique to being German. I think that's one of the themes that resonates in the book with today, is this idea of being an outsider in a place where there's an atmosphere of hatred. And I wanted to zoom out because in a little bit here, I'm watching the clock, in a little while, we're going to open up for questions. So if anybody who's listening live would like to ask a question, put it in the chat and we will get around to it. But so in addition to the very personal story, I mean, there is this great big geopolitical one. One of the things that affected me was the United States is, I mean, this is a very Canadian novel because the United States is off to the side, or maybe down to the side, and it's this menacing threat that it's made more sinister because you don't really talk about it that much except in its absence of what we think of the United States as being. I'm wondering how much this idea of the United States as a dark, menacing, neo-fascist place, how much of that was influenced by current events?
Yeah, well, current event for sure, right? But first of all, I have to say that I grew up on the North Shore of Lake Ontario, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just west of Toronto, and so like for the first 12 or 13 or 14 summers of my life, I was on the lake shore every day, and you can see the United States from, it's only like 15 miles across the water or something, and we'd always see like fires, not actual the fires, but we'd see smoke and stuff. And we would watch the Channel 7 news out of Tonawanda or something, and they would always be talking about fires. So, but we could see the smoke rising across the other side, on the other side of Lake Ontario. So, and I'd been told many times that's the U.S. over there. So in my own life as a little kid, it was really interesting to kind of see another country and watch the news coming out of the country and so on, every afternoon or whatever. So it was like this present. The States for me as a kid was a presence, and it was literally on the horizon, right, just across the water that we could see, right. So now moving into my novel, my character, like me, much like me, he's on the lakeshore a lot, hanging out with his brother and looking at the States and doing what they do. And so the United States in my novel is the worst case scenario. I mean, like, if the political situation, the current real political situation in the States continues, and the elections go the way that they're not supposed to go, we see, from my perspective, a sort of ratcheting up of fascistic tendencies, right? And in my novel, I've torqued those to the maximum, where the United States is in league with Nazi Germany and fascistic Europe, right? There is a non-aggression pact that's established between Berlin and Washington and so on. And so Canada, much like Cuba was during the Cold War, in reality, Canada becomes a client state of the Soviet Union. It's the last it's the last protectorate in the Americas of anti-fascist ideals. So it's communist, in fact. But there is this sort of like this power struggle between, like in the actual Cold War, there's a power struggle between the left and the right, between fascism and communism, in fact, that I guess, and I hope, kind of creates and maintains a tension that rolls through the whole novel.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is a political novel, but I mean, I don't write theme forward. I never think about themes. They just kind of like, or these ideas. I don't have a point to make when I'm writing a novel. Like, I'm really interested in characterization and in voice, and everything that happens after that is gravy. So like,
Mhm.
if there is a political theme that arises out of this story, that's great. And you know, I do have my political ideas, but I would never think of myself as a political writer. I think of myself as a, I don't know, a writer who's just really interested in observing people as the world, you know, sort of like churns around them and against them, and in their lives, and how we react to extreme circumstances and situations like that. And those are often, you know, political and or historical events and
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah. Well, we'll save for later. I might, just to be safe, I might ask you for if you have any advice on how someone might sneak across the border. Depending on how the election goes
Yeah,
on Tuesday,
right.
I might need some help.
Yeah, I'll meet you on the lake shore with some I don't know, granola bars or something.
Okay, I'm counting on it. Thank you. I'll say
Yeah,
for those of you who are logged in, if you have any questions, please fire away. I've got plenty, and I'm one of them is along that same thing. You were just talking about how you write. I believe you teach the art of writing historical fiction, correct? I'm
well,
wondering.
yeah, writing, yeah, novels and short stories, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm wondering, how is it when you are, how is it, what is there anything different about the process when you are writing a book of this nature, where you are making up the history, where you're trying to, you've taken this one real life event
Yeah.
and you've tweaked it, and now you have to imagine all the ramifications? How is that different from when you're writing something that's rooted firmly in
Yeah.
in fact?
Well,
What varies?
there's it's a lot of the novel, a lot of my attention as a writer went into the world building, right?
Mhm.
When you're creating an alternate history, or if you're gonna, like, you know, write some sci-fi or something, there are a lot of things you cannot take for granted when you're writing like straight realism. You know, you can take for granted that your reader knows that cars in this real world have four wheels, you know, and you know, we have three meals a day, and night falls, and then day, you know, then the sun rises in the morning. Those basic, you know, but you can't take for granted anything well, like that, yeah. But you can't take for granted the world in an alternate history. So there's a lot of attention that goes into, like, how do you describe the world in the voice of somebody for whom this world has always existed. This is the natural world, right? It would be very artificial to have a speaker speaking to the reader from this alternate history and say, oh, well, you don't know this, dear reader, but in fact, the sun rises at noon in this world instead of at 6 a.m. or whatever. I'm giving you a silly example. So that's probably the heaviest lift when it comes to writing an alternate history novel. And so, how do you do that? You have to, an ugly word, information, right? You have
Mhm.
to provide certain information. Let's call it context. You have to provide context and to help the reader understand, well, in fact, in this world, a car has five wheels, for example,
Mhm.
instead of, but a narrator wouldn't say, oh, dear reader, we have five-wheeled cars here, right? So I'm using that silly metaphor in order to help explain um, that you have to figure out ways how to provide the relevant context to the reader, and that often is, this is something that I've come to notice in my own work, that all this sort of necessary context in order to build the world um, should be filtered through the point of view of a character, and an opinion should be attached to it, right?
Mhm.
So or some sort of personal view. So to extend my silly metaphor, a narrator would say something like, I've always hated the fact that we have 5-wheeled cars, instead
Yeah.
of 3. Or wouldn't it make more sense to have a 6-wheeled car than a 5-wheeled car? But our silly world has 5, that kind of thing, right? So
Yeah.
you attach an opinion, or you have somebody speak whatever necessary context is. My my father grew every time my father heard the name, Göring, after the fact, my father went into a rage. He couldn't stand that Göring had taken the helm after Hitler's assassination, that kind of thing, right? So
Yeah.
you're not just like throwing some context down, you're attaching an opinion to it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think you do that very deftly. And I'm going to ask you to apply that. We have a question for the audience about um, wondering about the world that you built. Just assuming that Britain has fallen under, in this world, Britain is under Germany's control. Is that what has happened? And
Yes.
yeah, no, I like that. I'm realizing what you just described is the difference between the published novels I read as a teenager, where I was obsessed with alternate histories and worlds. It's that the difference between blending it in and weaving it in as I think a lot of those books had people coming out and speaking in ways they don't speak and to explain
Right.
the world. It's that
Right.
lecturing instead of letting it unfold.
Yeah. Right. When you try to do that heavy lifting world building in dialogue, it often it just falls really flat. You can tell the writer's trying to, provide that world building in dialogue, and that's not the place to do it.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, and there's still time for questions. And if we did not answer that question to your satisfaction, person who sent it in, send it in again, and we can explore it some more. One of the people that I did read, who was not a pulp writer, but one of the people who explored some of these themes was Kurt Vonnegut, and he gets the first word in this book. And I'm wondering about your connection with him. And he maybe gets more than the first word, but tell me about your connection with his work.
Kurt Vonnegut, he gets an epigraph that opens the novel, and that's kind of a key. It's like there's a lot going on in this novel that if the reader doesn't pick up, that's fine. But I've layered the novel in such a way that really super careful reading. And again, like this is not, you don't have to get this in order to enjoy the novel. But I was really interested in simulation theory as I wrote this novel, and the idea of generational guilt, and so I mean the Kurt Vonnegut references and the idea of stories within stories recurs through the novel. There's this idea of the hand of God in the simulation theory. That, I mean, if I'm sure everybody knows what the simulation theory is. How much time do we have here, Mike? Do we have like 5 minutes to go?
We can go over a couple of minutes if you can boil it down to about 30 seconds. I'm guessing.
Dude, I'm no physicist here. Like I know about like that much, but what I know, it's really a fascinating idea that if you kind of accept the premise that that humanity will continue on and create machines of such incredible power that eventually we will be able to create a machine, or like this is the internet, right? This is like virtual reality that is so perfect that it's conceivable that in fact we're in this already, right? So the idea that so that many thousands of years from now or something, anthropologists can create 20th century or 21st century Texas or Toronto or whatever, to go back and study who we used to be, right? So this is like a sort of effort at archaeology and anthropology and so on. And so the idea is presented in a novel within my novel that Muriel shows William, and it's a science fiction novel, and there's a reference to Kilgore Trout, who is a Kurt Vonnegut science fiction writer within his own novels, and so on. So the idea is that this I don't know if I'm giving away too much, man. This is just an idea.
I didn't want to spoil. I didn't want to give that away, but you certainly can. You're right.
This
It's
isn't
not
like part of the plot, but this is just a little bit of gravy on the side here.
No, that's exactly it.
So the novel within the novel that the narrator is shown tells a story of a society that creates this sort of simulation theory in order to serve as a penal colony for the descendants of those who had created such heinous crimes that their ancestors must continue to suffer. So this is a nod to the idea of the generational guilt that I feel as a German Canadian, and that William feels as a German kid growing up in 1960 after the Nazis win the war.
That particular nugget will stick with me. I've been pondering it a lot, so I'm glad you brought it up. And
Cool.
we have, I think we have time for. We have an audience question, and it's about craft, and this may be the last thing we have time for. We're asked, at what point do you know that a manuscript is good enough and that you're not going to do any more drafts? And the follows up with where does your second draft figure into this? How do you know when you're done?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a hard question to answer. It's had you fully developed your story? I mean, like, listen, you're gonna finish draft number 1, number 2, number 3, and then you're gonna send it to your trusted reader or whatever, and they're gonna send it back to you and say, I love it, but work on this, and then it eventually gets to an agent, and then like every stage it will come back to you, right? So don't think you have to nail it in order to get it out the door, right? The creative process. It's creation and destruction, right? It's like you create and then you delete, you create and you destroy. It's really a process, and the process is important because you begin to learn to interrogate your own work. You begin to learn to read it objectively, right? So when you're actually going in on the draft, you're like hardcore on it. It's your baby. It's like your heart and soul, your ego, your being, your identity, and so on. You pour it out, and that's fine, right? And then as you're doing that, you're reading good books at night, and like you're learning to read like a writer, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's what I always, when I'm talking to students about this, you got to learn to read like a writer. First, you read for pleasure, and then you read for craft, right? And you begin to understand how that writer is moving their people across the page and advancing plot and deepening characterization and all that stuff. So as you write deeper into your story, you're reading other novels, you're getting inspired, you're learning craft issues and so on. So you're not going to get to the point where, you write the end at the end of your manuscript and it's done. Mm-hmm. Right, it's done for this draft. You send it off to your favorite reader, etc. Tell your story. Tell your story first. Ask yourself if remind yourself why you're writing about your character. Your protagonist. Your protagonist. You're going to spend 3 years with your protagonist. Your protagonist has to be unique and interesting and has to have you have to have some deep connection with your character. And so if you have fully explored your relationship with that character, we have to love, as writers, we have to be interested in our characters. Mm-hmm. They're not just a name you're moving around the chessboard, right? You have to really connect with them and respect them and challenge them, and right. So it's really just a question of not thinking that you need to, or that you can, write to the right, finish your story perfectly, right? To the point where you're looking at perfection, right? Yeah. You write the story, you end the story, you take the story to its surprising and inevitable conclusion, right? And as you write that, it blows you away. Oh my God, I didn't see that coming. That's wonderful, right? Because that's the feeling that you want to inspire in your reader, right? Yeah. That's why you should never, in my estimation, why you should never preordain or engineer your plot, like that's going to end up with just being a flat fake book, in my opinion. Right. So just, write your story, right into the mystery of your story, finish it, take a break, walk the dog for a couple of months or whatever, come back, send it off to your friends or whatever. I don't know if that's kind of answering your question or not. But
that's a great answer. I love that. And I will add my 2 cents is that I remember when I sent off my one novel, when we sent it to the publisher, I think that was rewrite number 6. And I thought, well, once we actually get the contract, we'll be done. Now, this is going to slide right through, because what more could be done after 6 rewrites? And the version that was printed, they every time we did a rewrite, they changed the version number. We were at number 13.
Yeah.
So I bring that up only because if people who don't go through the writing process kind of think that, it's just there, you're done, and it goes off. And it's like, no, it's constantly evolving, and you have to. It's never. It's never done.
To write a novel, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Right. You've got to really stick with it. Tenacity, right? Tenacity that's
exactly.
Like, you got to get up in the morning and do it. It's like, don't wait for the inspiration. Don't sort of draw up some big sort of plot scheme or whatever. That's gonna end up just being terrible, I think. So just keep doing it, man. Just always. And if you're looking at the blank page, do that. Just think about, why do I love this person again so much that I want to write a whole book about them? It's like, what is it that they're really interested in? What is it they're really afraid of? What do they fear? What do they fear? What do they long for? That's, find something interesting and compelling about your character. Otherwise, they're not a good protagonist if they don't have some deep longing or fear that motivates them.
Yeah, I think we're going to unfortunately have to wrap it up, because this is I could talk about this stuff all day, but I think that there was a hard time limit on how much. I have from the audience, we have a thank you for an inspiring interview, and I will echo that. That was terrific. The book. The book again is The Good German. The author is Dennis Bock. If you're watching this in the United States, it is published by HarperCollins Canada. So your favorite independent local bookseller might have to pull some strings to get a copy, but it's worth it. Find it, and with luck, we'll see it. Maybe it will be here by more direct means soon.
And I presume you can get it on Kindle. I mean, it is available as an ebook, and I think those are easy to get online, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, Mike, thanks a lot for your time. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for yours. It was a delightful read and a good conversation. And and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Thea and Zeke Fritz, who was our technical guy who put up with all the questions and got us all together here. And check out the website, writersatlarge.com. And we will see you next time with luck. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dennis.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.